Welcome to the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums virtual program, Redefining Narrative, a series of conversations with scholars and leaders in the cultural sector. I'm Deborah Schwartz. I serve on the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums Board of Directors, and I am delighted to be your host today. Redefining Narrative invites viewers to explore new approaches to working within the cultural sector, presenting fresh ideas about the pressing issues of our time, and in many cases, disrupting age-old formulas for what we expect to find within the confines of museums. Each episode is approximately 30 minutes, and we hope each of our 5-part series will encourage conversation and debate for people working in museums, as well as students and the general public who are curious about why and how museums make choices about exhibitions and programs. With much appreciation on behalf of the staff and board of the Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums, I want to acknowledge that this program was funded in part by Humanities New York with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In today's episode of Redefining Narrative, we will talk about the erasure of Native American culture from our traditional historical narratives and how we are beginning, finally, to see the introduction of Native voices into the historical record. Our speaker, Kevin White, will also touch upon the notion of storytelling and the differences between the Native American approach versus the standard linear approach to storytelling that are more recognized in Eurocentric cultural presentations. This, of course, leads us back to our focus on museums, their role as institutions that not only exhibit artifacts, but also provide opportunities for research. We have asked Kevin to include in his talk some of his honest assessment of the ways in which museums have failed the Indigenous communities, creating distrust, as well as the ways in which museums and archives have advanced the work he will discuss with us today. Kevin White is an Indigenous scholar, Mohawk, from Akwesasne, with family from Tonawanda Band of Seneca, whose work focuses primarily on Haudenosaunee creation and culture. White is guided by and consults regularly with community members and scholars alike, as witnessed in his co-authored article, La Salle and Seneca Creation, 1678. White is currently working on his first book, revisiting Hewitt's Iroquois Cosmology, Part 1. Kevin is also working with the Six Nations Grand River community in the Descahe project and the Wa Story Collection, 2 community-based projects. He is, and I imagine this is almost in your spare time, Kevin, assistant professor in the Department for Study of Religion and Center for Indigenous Studies at University of Toronto. And I want to welcome you, Kevin, and I also want to beg your forgiveness for my not very good pronunciation, which I know you will correct as your talk goes along. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Deborah. Segos Ganagoa, Kevin White Yungats, which is our way of saying, I'm thankful you are well, and they call me Kevin White. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and jump right into the presentation so that we use the time best and most efficiently. So this is an interesting intersection for me of redefining narratives, Haudenosaunee storytelling, the Wall Project, and orality. A lot of my work has been centered on orality storytelling, oral history, in this way of looking at things. And so there's an interesting intersection in how we look at things with museum studies, research centers, archives, and the like, and how we kind of come together and are having more fruitful discussions now than in the recent past. And there's a few reasons why I think this happens historically and how we understand things. I always like to start out with this kind of exercise in a piece of work by Lindley Logan, Deer Clan Seneca Nation, that looks at part of how he understands and portrays the Haudenosaunee creation story or cosmological narrative. And he's titled it Sky Woman, Earth Grasper. And this is a really poignant piece for me to kind of look at this, because it's not just art, but it's also a way of understanding how orality and storytelling actually works, and how we then frame it within the discourse within museums and within archives and within public settings. We would look at this piece and suggest that there's different ways of interpretation of this material, of this piece, of this artwork. But would we ever either suggest that Logan was wrong in how we portrayed it, or would we suggest that somebody is wrong in their interpretation of it, or are there fruitful discussions to be had, even at times if there's somewhat uncomfortable discussions to be had? And I think this is a really imperative piece, because it also allows the audience, the person partaking in some of this, to have their own way of thinking about it and their own way of interpreting this piece. And my mentor and friend John Mohawk once said this, that it's a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois way of doing things to share a story, but refuse to tell the listener what they should have learned out of the story. Rather, the narrator or the storyteller, the knowledge keeper, the holder of tradition would then ask the person to use their own mind to reason out what they think it means. And it is that area that I think this discussion really kind of takes place between museums, between archives, and between Indigenous communities. And we're getting to some of the reasons why some of these problems that we see and are trying to reconcile today are part of this discussion. So I want to start out with something very kind of basic, which is, how do we remember things as Haudenosaunee people? You know, it's often understood that Indigenous peoples did not have a form of writing. And I'm not sure I fully agree with that for a variety of reasons. Maybe we didn't have the alphanumeric form of writing and the Western alphabet and number system, but we did have a methodology for remembering things, for record keeping. And some of these examples, for example, are right here on the slide, with the circle wampum, which is about the foundation of the Confederacy and how people are seated at Grand Council, how the 50 strings represent the 50 leaders, both male and female, for the represented on clan, that people came together and used their best good mind to discuss things. We obviously can see that the longhouses and I've been to exhibits, mostly New York and other places, that really examine this and create this kind of throwback knowledge of how we existed as people, where you had a family that was connected through the longhouse. One of the longest longhouses on record, I believe, was about 300 feet in length, so about the size of a modern day football field. But we also did have ways of record keeping. So wampum was one methodology, and in the my lower left corner, you'll see the purple and white shell, and the which is a quahog shell, and the other shell, which is a whelk shell. Now, what's interesting is that these two shells become the foundational basis for wampum, which is a form of record keeping. But in the natural world, they are also the only two shells that can harm or destroy each other. And yet they come together in this way of using reason within the Great Law to find a way to coexist for our record keeping. In the upper right corner, you see a small close-up shot of the condolence cane. I couldn't quite fit the bigger condolence cane on here, but those are a mnemonic device for people to kind of remember the titles of the 50 positions of the leaders, how they're seated within the nation system, and how the foundation functions in this way. So this is why I say it's not always fair to say that we didn't have a written format. We just didn't have a written format that everybody else understood in some capacity. And so when I like to kind of talk about this, is some examples of our wampum belts that date from pre-contact and early contact to right up through treaty making in the 1600s and even the 1790s. For Haudenosaunee people and thinkers, there's three big meta-narratives that we operate from. The creation or the cosmological narrative, how the world came to be. We believe the world rests on the back of a great turtle. But over time, humans do what humans do, and we inevitably forgot our role, our responsibilities, and our instructions. And we had to have them reinstilled by the natural world in some capacity. But then there came another time where we began to have conflict with one another that led to great despair and great fear and great violence. And so the Great Law comes about from a man we call a peacemaker, and Ainwentha, or some people call him Hiawatha. And together they bring this message of peace to the 5 warring nations, which is symbolized by the wampum belt in the middle. You sometimes might see it today displayed as our Haudenosaunee flag, with the Mohawks and Senecas on the outside, the Cayugas and the Oneidas on the inside, and the Onondagas seated at the tree. So this represents our great law and how we came together using our best good minds and good thinking to resolve conflict and establish peace through reason. And then around the time of the 1790s, 1820s, a third prophet comes, or a third messenger comes. We prefer the term messenger, Handsome Lake. And he begins to deliver this message of how to return to our old ways of thinking and not lose ourselves in the modern conveniences and other things that are going on, and still maintain that traditional reciprocal relationship with the natural world and with other parts of humanity. And so when we understand all of these dynamics as they function together, that is the root of our knowledge systems. In other words, what I would call an epistemology framework, as well as how we engage with each other in the natural world. When we look at some of the treaties that were established in pre-contact, meaning before Europeans or Euro-Americans and Canadians come to this new world, we had the dish with one spoon, where we view the natural world as basically a giant dish. We would only use a spoon, and each nation and community and individual had equal access, but you never took more than you needed. You left the dish clean, and you always left something for the future generations. Then the next belt is the Hiawatha belt, which I've already talked about briefly. The third belt is the ever-growing tree, that talks about how our reasoning and communities and confederacy work together. And then as Europeans start to come to this new world, which is an old world for us, we see the establishment of the 2-row wampum, which guides how we're supposed to relate to each other diplomatically through our governance models. The 2 purple rows are parallel. One is the boat for the Dutch and later represents the Europeans. The other is for our canoe, that we are bonded together through the covenant chain and peace and friendship to travel down this river of life together. And so we're not supposed to interfere with the governance of the boat, and nor should the boat interfere with the governance of the canoe. However, history bears a different story on that, but we still practice those ideals and in principle, and has a value system in a lot of our communities to this day. And I use the Canandaigua Treaty as this kind of understanding to show and demonstrate that even English, the French, the Dutch, eventually Americans and Canadians understood wampum, understood treaty making, understood the diplomacy and pragmatic skills of not only the Haudenosaunee, but other Indigenous communities. And so this is usually called the George Washington Belt, where Washington had it commissioned in order to use our way of remembering things for the Canandaigua Treaty signed in the 1790s. But there's something that Anishinaabe scholar Alan Corbet has made a point of, that wampum did not seal an agreement or merely seal an agreement, but marked the beginning of an agreement or relationship. We were looking at relationships, and this is how I think in some cases the museums and archives and Indigenous communities can come together and start to renew this relationship and restore the relationships. We have to think about it in that way. One of the biggest things I focus on in terms of Indigenous storytelling and orality is that we have to really think about it in these kind of constructs, that storytelling is both old and contemporary, meaning that it predates contact and continues to this day. It's a human endeavor to share stories. What we have to learn is how to understand how the stories are passed through the generations, how the knowledge is passed down through the generations, how the value systems are passed down through the generations. And this is the part that I think we still have a lot of work to do on. So in short, academics and scholars have largely confined stories and knowledge systems under an archaic and antiquated notion of mythology and folklore, sometimes called folk tales. And I take exception with this for a variety of reasons, because these are true epistemological frameworks. The stories may contain information about the stars, about how they're aligned, about different seasons and different ways things relate. So for example, when the Pleiades stars begin to disappear in late fall, there's a story that talks about the great bear that runs across the sky, and he's wounded, and as he's running away, it's the time of the year when all the leaves change. And so some of those colored leaves reflect the wounded bear. But we also know that in the wintertime, those seven brothers and sisters, or seven sisters, rise again. And that triggers our new year. That begins to think about what we should do in the upcoming year. So there is an issue within these frameworks meant to deny the epistemological underpinnings has essentially mere myths and folktales. Though some of the stories are meant to be entertaining and informative, they explain how things came to be. Like, I remember hearing the story as a kid about the raccoon and how it got its mask, or dogs that are still searching for the original tails. And there's great elaborative, sometimes seemingly simplistic notions in this that explain value systems, that explain how things should be related to, how we understand things, and how the young people learn to act in an appropriate manner or within cultural norms. Sadly, for a very long time, a lot of these stories and ways of knowing were not considered knowledge. They were not considered complex, or even as layered as they are today. And this is a really imperative fundamental point to contemplate. That once we go back, for example, most of my work in the last 15 to 20 years is centered on the creation story of the cosmological narrative. There's roughly 39 versions, the last time I counted, about a year ago, that are printed and published. They vary in length from just a handful of pages to upwards of 300 pages. Some of it's in the language, some of it's told in different ways, but there's a complex layer in the story that I'm still unpacking all these years later. And I have very long conversations with community members, with archivists, with other academics about how we better interpret this story. So in the field of Indigenous studies, there's not only the work of orality and storytelling, but now literary criticism, as well as the usual genres of literature: poetry, short stories, novellas, complex Pulitzer Prize winning novels. And so in this way of thinking, what are all these stories meant to do? They're meant to pass along knowledge. They're meant to share values. They're meant to inform discussions. We have different ways of looking at things individually and collectively. And I think one of the biggest things I try often to teach my students and discussions like this is that we must essentially do away with this idea that all Indigenous peoples are one in the same group. We are very different people, even as a confederation of 5 nations, now 6 nations. The Haudenosaunee have different outlooks and different interpretations of stories and different ways of thinking about that system and how humans relate to the natural world and the universe. So this is a really imperative part to this discussion, because these, for me, are the eras of Indigenous knowledge and how the stories were gathered and began to be studied. So in early colonial contact periods, so think the 1600s through much of the 1700s, there was a comparative analysis done to Western culture in order to evaluate Indigenous peoples and communities and nations on a scale of civilization, which of course also suggested that in this kind of early colonial period, that Western culture was the pinnacle of all civilization, that they had advanced that far in human history, that they were the model with which to be compared to as the most civilized and such. And this is a really interesting notion for me, because when we think about some of the methodologies and values and ways that people espoused civility was defined and enacted as, many Indigenous communities already did that, in some cases surpassed that. And I'm not going to get into that discussion about, who's more civilized, who's less civilized. That's not really part of this for me. But then comes the studies in the 1700s and the 1800s, the 18th and 19th centuries, where their Indigenous peoples are studies of curiosity. They're seen as, in some cases, childlike, as communities that are in need of a strong parental model and guidance to become fully part of the civilized society of the Western world. But this is also the act of colonization. We have to really think about how this is being framed. We have to think about what is being suggested and what is going on here. So then I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit, because we're into this a little bit, and the confinement to reserves and forced relocations do cause internal strains. So that's where that person Hanson Lake comes in with a way to restore balance to the mind and the community and the culture. This leads to the revitalization movements in the 18th and 19th century. I'll give you another example of a revitalization movement. And that was out in the plains areas when the ghost dance began to evolve as a way to kind of reduce those internal strains and reduce that unbalanced people felt within themselves and within the community and how they were living their lives. But this is the big part where we're going to discuss some of this part right now, is that salvage ethnography period. For me, that usually denotes the years 1870 through roughly the 1930s or 40s, though some might argue well into the 1950s. And here's the biggest irony. As residential schools became mandated for Indigenous children to attend, and we can talk about all the problems that were not only instilled in them, but of course the abuse and the harm that they did, not only to children, but to communities, to language, and to Indigenous knowledge systems. So residential schools were purposely designed to remove Indigenous knowledge and language from children, convert them forcibly almost to Christianity. And this is part of this, because this is the reason self-ethnography begins to percolate and gain support. Because at that same time as children are being forcibly removed from their homes, their communities, their languages, their knowledge, academics are rushing out into the field to procure material culture, to procure stories that are being told by the older generations of Indigenous people, because it was a true belief in the salvage ethnography period, thus its name, that the Indigenous peoples and communities and cultures would eventually fade into the sunset of human history, that they would cease to be distinctive peoples and distinctive cultures. And this is where we also see anthropology really begin to develop in earnest. Think of Boas and Levi Strauss and Frank Speck and others. Most of it was centered on Indigenous knowledge, but it was merely studied as mythology, folklore, and folk tales, rather than true knowledge systems and epistemologies. And this is where we get into something that happens in the early part of the 20th century that continues well into the 1960s and 1970s. And that is William Fenton. He becomes the Dean of Iroquois Studies. And as I tell my students all the time, it's always good to have an intellectual nemesis. And for me, my intellectual nemesis is William Fenton. But he establishes a group of scholars and academics that begin to focus solely on the study of Haudenosaunee people or Iroquois culture and history. But there's also a big note of this in academic gatekeeping, because it is a fair thing to say, Fenton has said it and others before him have said it, that the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois are one of the most written about and studied groups in North American Indigenous history and continue to be. I'll give you an example. In the last 5 years, 2016 to 2020, thinking pre-COVID here, roughly 53 dissertations or master's theses were produced on or about the Haudenosaunee in a 5-year window. And so when we start thinking about this, are people studying Haudenosaunee as a living, breathing culture, or are they studying them as a relic of the past and how different some of the cultures are? Which is problematic for me, because then we get into this notion that cultures are static and unchanging, when in fact we know that's not the case. But Fenton, in order to really study the changes within the culture externally and internally, he begins to academic gatekeep and take the materials that were gathered during salvage ethnography and guard them from being accessed by Indigenous communities in order to retain the language, in order to retain the cultural knowledge, in order to retain the value systems. And there's these great number of stories about this in this capacity. One of them is that there was a Haudenosaunee singer that wanted access to hear some of the old wax cylinder recordings in order to incorporate them into some of her music. And he hears this and initially denies it and says, no, nobody can have access to these. And then he hears her sing and falls in love with her voice. So he says, of course she can have access, but only she can have access to it. And that's the academic gatekeeping I'm talking about. And so this also created essentially an inherent distrust of academics, museums, archives, because they seemed to be inaccessible. And so today, Indigenous peoples, communities, and individuals and scholars like myself are accessing these very institutions that once seemed to be closed to us, to recover knowledge, to begin to look at recitations and language revitalizations. But this movement is only a little bit over 50 years old. It begins in the 1960s and moves forward slowly. The individuals that trained me as a scholar were people that were very much denied access to the archives and to the museums and to collections. We can look at Fenton again, and when NAGPRA begins to evolve in the 1990s and becomes federal law, he fought against the return of wampum belts and our sacred mass to our communities, because he feared that it would deny him and others access, or that we lacked the ability to properly care for these things. Well, by their very definition, if they're sacred, then we're going to understand how to care for them. So I showed you that image of the Hiawatha belt that was a little bit tattered. When that was returned, it was repaired, and it looks gorgeous today. It's fully tied together, and it was restored in much the same methodology and ways of doing it that was established centuries ago. And so this is part of the problem. We have to think about these voices of our ancestors, these shared knowledge systems that were meant not to just be studied in closed quarters, but shared with everybody. This was how we were reminded to be good-minded in how we lived our lives. And this is important because I want to emphasize some of this is how we begin to reestablish and repair these relationships. Jake Thomas, who was one of the chiefs at Six Nations, said this in 1977. There are no experts in Iroquois culture. When we come together, we say that we put our minds on the table. That way, if you have knowledge I can use, I can borrow it. And if I have knowledge you can use, you can borrow. We always learn something. We always have something to learn, excuse me. And John Mohawk says it a slightly different way. He once told an audience that to say an individual is inherently smart because of their talent, their research, their whatever, their own unique gifts, is to miss the point that the universe instilled some of these things in that person, that it was a gift from the universe, that it was not something that was supposed to be owned individually, that we always come together and share our words and share our minds, and we find common agreement, and we find ways to exist within these frameworks of knowledge. And it takes so many of us to unpack the cosmology story that I've been doing it for 15 years. So I want to briefly touch on the Haudenosaunee project, which is known as the Wall Project in some capacity, in some ways. This is a collection of so that's our image. That's the one we're using right now. We're trying to invoke that storytelling and passing things across the fire, along with symbols and other parts of our community material culture that is woven into this. These are our mnemonic devices. These are our memory tools. And this is how we share knowledge, is through discussion. So Frederick Wilkerson Waugh was born in Langford. I'm not going to read everything to you, but he did a lot of work at Six Nations Grand Rimmer every summer between 1911 and 1918, with the exception of 1917. Some 157 stories, over 700 pages were gathered by Waugh from 23 individuals, 21 men, 2 women, all contributed stories. Here's a breakdown for you. The Kiigwe have 93 stories in the collection. 43 stories are Onondaga, 6 are Mohawk, 4 are Oneida, Seneca have 3, and Tuscarora have 8 stories. What happens in the early 20th century is that Six Nations Grand River becomes kind of the cultural hub and the salvage ethnography hub, because all 6 nations live there. All 6 languages are fairly spoken fluently. We have a lot of this old material knowledge and know-how and intellectual stories that are part of it in the community. Excuse me. And so when we look at our project, some of my students this summer were helping us index his notebooks. He has 250 photographs that he took. He purchased or obtained 540 pieces of material culture. His 55 field notebooks during his visits are part of the project as well. And we're really kind of trying to understand what Waugh was doing and how he framed it for the Canadian Museum of History. And so part of his collection, or most of his collection, is in the Canadian Museum of History, some parts of it at the American Philosophical Society. But this is another one of those instances where academic gatekeeping reared its head, because the Waugh collection was inaccessible to us until recently, in part because Fenton had removed it from the museums for his study and continued study of Haudenosaunee people and culture. And therefore we weren't able to access it. So now we're trying to use this, and this is part of our project, is not only to return the knowledge, but for example, some of the stories that we're working with, we're retranslated into each of the 6 languages for language revitalization, with the younger generations in mind, of teaching them our value system, our knowledge system, and the language all at the same time. In other words, to repair some of the damages done by the residential schools. But we need access to this material, and we need the speakers today to work with us as they are in this project. And so this becomes part and parcel of all these ways of thinking and knowing that are important. So reality has been categorized most often as mythology, folklore. but I view them as epistemology and knowledge systems. There's this tension between the eradication of culture, language, and knowledge from children while procuring it for posterity's sake from the older generations of Indigenous peoples. So today, archive collections and museum collections are treasure troves to revisit these value systems, the knowledge systems, and the stories in order for us as Haudenosaunee people to hear the echoes of our ancestors. And I really think that's an important way to frame this, because it's interesting when you come across somebody you know or somebody that's in your family, and you find them in the archives, you find them in museum collections, you find them in different ways. And so it makes history real. It validates a lot of thinking and things that we sometimes only think of as family knowledge. I will end now with how I understand and explore the intersection of orality, memory, and culture. And this is part of my creation work, is at the convergence of sound, listening, and thought, orality is produced. Orality gives birth to word, word gives birth to meaning, meaning begets language, language evolves into story, story morphs into history, history becomes memory, memory educates thought, thought shapes orality, and orality shapes story. So, and then we'll throw this up for a quick second. That's the works cited from some of the stuff I've done over the years. And I am going to stop sharing the screen now. And thank you. I realized I might have moved a little fast for the ASL, and I appreciate that. So I tried to slow down, but I get in the flow, and I try to condense as much as I can.
Thank you, Kevin. That was amazing. Part of, I think, what happens when you're sort of explaining so much that I think a lot of us have not been exposed to, is that it's incredibly exciting and stimulating. And so I'm going to have to just pick a few of my questions
Sure.
to try to get you to stop and revisit some of the incredibly interesting, important points that you made. It was just an incredible presentation. I'll make one observation that may be terribly obvious to you, but from where I sit in the world of museums, whether it's art museums or history museums or other kinds of museums, the kind of knowledge that you are now unpacking and formulating and reformulating because you have access to this material, it makes it so clear that our museums must try to find ways to have both staff from Indigenous cultures and also, partnerships with, whether it's people like you, yourself, or organizations that are doing this work actively, because without that, the pull of our Eurocentric earlier versions of what we know are never going to be broken, it seems to me. And I don't know whether you've had those kinds. I'm sure you had those kinds of conversations all the time with people in museums, but it's so evident as you talk about what you're learning.
Well, and I think that is an imperative point to make. And there are people that are doing a lot of true work with museums, both here in Canada and New York and the US, about how we look at things that are even should be shared and perhaps shouldn't be shared. And a quick example of that is the sacred mass that I was talking about. They're a curiosity, and yet as part of our cultural dynamic, only the caretakers of those masks are supposed to handle them. They're supposed to be maintained in a certain way. And there's even an understanding that because they date back to creation, representing one of the actors of creation, that's very powerful. And so if they're mishandled, they can actually turn malevolent against humans. And so that's, it's a belief, but it's a really big responsibility to caretake one of those masks. And and so there's protocols to it. And I think of the same thing with wampum butts. It was when I read, I believe it was around the 1990s when NAGPRA was enacted, and the standing committee from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had a number of people including a good friend of mine, Rick Hill, talking about this, about the return of wampum belts. And, you know, it was articulated. I think Fenton took out a full page New York Times ad basically arguing against this, that it would limit him and other scholars from, and that we wouldn't properly caretake these items, you know, and in some cases there's still problems because in terms of the preservation, many of those masks that were returned are unusable now, or cannot be cared for in the manner that they're supposed to be because of the different preservatives that were put on that are toxic to humans. And it also goes deeper than that in terms of the knowledge systems, I think, of how we look at this. But now there are museums, at least some of them, that are really advocating and putting Indigenous people on, you know, on their boards and in their museums, and talking with them and working with them. You know, I wish more would do it. That's a key component of this. And there's other people now that are allies that are truly beginning to understand and help these dynamics further. I mean, you know, I sit on the New York State Historical Records and Archives Board as an advisor, one of many from throughout the state. And so there's also, I can think of an example at Ganondagan State Historic Site, one of the only state parks in New York that's dedicated to Haudenosaunee history, or Seneca history in particular. Staff has largely always been Indigenous there. You know, there's a person at the Rochester Science Museum Center that is doing great work. And it's interesting to watch people like Malgo Galvin and Jamie Jacobs that have come back in with these museums, but relearn some of the old material culture ways of doing things, and are producing and reproducing and teaching others how to do porcupine quill work, looking at designs, looking at all of that. And they do gorgeous work. You know, within a handful of years, they've educated a great number of community members on how to do this, because of course, porcupine quill work predates glass beads and other beads that began to be traded for in the early contact period. You know, turns out I'm not nimble enough with my fingers to actually do that kind of quill work, but I admire greatly those that do that kind of work.
That's great. I guess, you know, for me, this also connects to, you know, all your comments about the gatekeeping. And, you know, I wonder if you could say a few words about, you know, if somebody listening to this presentation says, you know, I'm recognizing my institution, you know, I hear that, and I've seen it, and I want to try to break through that. Do you have words of wisdom for either, you know, who people should be talking to other than yourself, or in addition to yourself, or, you know, are there some models that, you know, you have seen that you would like to make sure people know about to help them do the right thing?
I think that's a really important point to discuss further, I think, because we need the help in a lot of ways, because it took, I mean, if we really look at Indigenous studies, where it begins to be studied and researched and enacted by Indigenous scholars, it's a relatively young field.
Yeah.
It begins in the 1960s and 70s. And so the individuals like John Mohawk and Rick Hill and Oren Lyons and Jolene Rickard, who helped train me, often were denied access to the archives, to the museums, or limited in what they could access, you know, and so they found workarounds. And you can still bear some of that witness in my peer group. I mean, most of my dissertation work is unpublished narratives. I didn't access the archives because we assumed that I would be denied as well. And that is changing. Museums and archives are opening up, but there's also that layer of distrust in there, because even there are times where some of the community members, even though I'm Indigenous as a scholar, wonder what I'm coming in to extract out and not give back to the community. And, you know, that's why it's really important for me to be involved in community-centered and community-based work, because that's one of the fears I'm trying to allay and return this knowledge that is rich, that is going to lead us to discussions for future generations, for generations. And there's a great number of individuals. I don't do it unless you reference the La Salle piece in 1687. I came to that because of Michael Galvin had discovered it with conversation with somebody at a museum that knew about it. It was an unpublished manuscript. It was a Seneca version of creation. he asked me where it fit into the Seneca narrations of creation, and it was one of the earliest ones recorded, but it was written in French. So he contacted somebody and they helped translate it from French into English. And here's the rub of it. It became a piece that's very central because it shows the version that was recorded in 1896 with Chief John Armstrong was not an anomaly. That was in fact a distinctive Seneca version. So now we have two pieces, 1687 to 1896, and they're virtually, you can tell that they're related, that they're distinctively Seneca. And so now I conclude the article with asking the question, is it now to be considered a written story, or is it still considered oral history? How do we look at it? How do we examine it? And one of the interesting things is there was a point that LaSalle makes when he's talking to the person transcribing the story for him. And the person transcribing the story says, well, what does this story mean? And LaSalle turns to him apparently and says, well, what do you think it means? Which is harkens what John Mohawk says as an introduction, is that, you know, we're to use our own mind to interpret what we think it means and then have a discussion about it, usually over a bowl of soup and good food, you know, and then you have to round out the night with some social dancing. Yeah, exactly. But it, you know, in these dynamics, I think I've seen a lot of movement in museums and archives, but you know, there is some still reticence at time. But I have to, you know, tell you that the generation of scholars that are Indigenous coming after myself and my peer group are fierce. They hold people accountable, and you know, they're going to be advocating not only for this knowledge, they've also learned the languages, so that they're doing things both ways. So it's really fundamental to start thinking about this. And you know, one of the things I was talking with a friend and a colleague at American Philosophical Society, he said, you know, these are open to anybody. How do we get this information out? And I think that's a question that archives and museums have to ask themselves: is how do they build that relationship with communities? How do they repair those relationships? Because inevitably it can be viewed as very much what it is this is our intellectual knowledge, you know, and we seem to have no problem with corporations patenting and putting stamps of ownership on their intellectual knowledge. Well, why is, and that's the other thing, ethically, I want to see a lot of discussion about ethics, because, you know, when we talk about Hewitt's creation story, where is his secondary line that he worked with Chief John Armstrong, Chief John Buck, and Seth Newhouse? Should they not be co-authors on that because they are providing the knowledge? And the other thing I've talked with language speakers is they say, you know, sometimes when you look at these stories, you really have to hear them carefully in the language, because those people that were telling the story may have disordered or reordered the story so that only makes sense in the language, and it won't make as much sense in the English translation. And so, you know, and that's not to say that we don't have individuals that have been doing this for a long time. Hewitt was doing it, Arthur C. Parker, his uncle Ely Parker in the 1850s with Lewis Henry Morgan. So there's a lot of history here. And I go back to that quote from Jake Thomas, which is that we are meant to share this knowledge. It is not meant to be isolated and only owned and studied by a few, which is exactly what Fenton did. And that's why I work against that kind of mentality, because it's really responsible and ethically sound to use reason to be pragmatic and share this knowledge and understanding. Of course, the other part of that is that we have to be careful, because some people come in and change it to their own needs and then profit from it, which is another problem. But that's a different discussion for a different day.
You know, I'm thinking about when we talk about how do you spread the word that this material is more and more available to people. Are there any museums, to your knowledge, that have actually done exhibitions in which even this methodology begins to be shared? And you know, that are there attempts that museums are making to sort of help people see it in a different way?
Oh yeah, very much so. But it's been really recent work. I mean, the National Museum of the American Indian and the Washington Mall is an example where there was a lot of collaborative work done. You know, we've got a number of curators and people that have done this kind of work, not only for their own curiosity and knowledge acquisition, but in really trying to help tell a better story. Because that's one of the problems we have too, is that there is a constructed mythology about Indigenous people. And, you know, we have to start to move away from that narrative, because it's not accurate. It never has been. You know, that we're all one homogenous group is as far askew of lived experience as possible. You know, and so And the key is don't just ask one person to sit on an advisory board or come in. Ask a few people, because we do have divergent views. I've been told by community members I'm wrong on something or other, and that leads to a discussion. So, I'm always leery of somebody that kind of steps forward and says, I'm the expert on stuff, because that's a foreign concept to us, because it is a collective knowledge. It's meant to be collectively shared and interpreted and understood and talked about, and that's why I take that point that I kind of paraphrase it. It might have been a little bit too brief of a paraphrase, but that's what John Mohawk was talking about, was that and so is Jake Thomas. It's not owned by us as individuals. That's more of a Western concept. And, and that way, I think it's really imperative to move back to the Indigenous people, because I've heard accountings of oral stories where you spend 30 years learning the stories as they're recited, and then it's still the responsibility of the people listening, if you make a mistake, to correct you gently, and so that becomes part of that gentle nature too, and so like I'm excited now, because I've started to visit the archives. Like, I've worked with the published works, but now I want to go back and see what Hewitt wrote in his notes. What did he take out? What did he include? What did he omit? Why did he omit it? How many drafts did it take to get to the final version that he published in 1903 or 1928 or 25? So, that's the richest stuff, because that stuff we can take back to the community and say, here's what we think this story means. And Waugh and others that were doing this work were using Western concepts. So they have witches and warlocks in the stories instead of people that were doing that kind of thing, and sometimes good and sometimes bad, because humans are both good and bad. So we have to really think about that. But that's up to the community and the culture and the language to help dictate that and figure out. And that's what we're doing in the Waugh Project, consulting with people, saying, okay, this is what the story was recorded as. This is what we think it means. What do you think it means?
It's great. Do you imagine, Kevin, that at some point, say at the New York State Museum or somewhere else, that you might be sort of creating some kind of exhibition that would accompany what you're learning from all of this?
I don't know if it's going to be. I know we're doing it because our primary focus for the Grishoni project is community first, and we're also working with other knowledge keepers to determine what is appropriate to share with the wider world audience and what may be just for our community. Because that is part of the structure that we have to talk about too, is that some of these things like the masks and stories and even knowledge is powerful, and so it isn't meant to be shared with everybody. But this is also part of the problem of salvage ethnography in that period too, is it was an insatiable curiosity. So people wanted to know, and they felt they had a right to know everything. And I ask you to flip the script. Are there parts of the Vatican that are closed off? Are there parts of the Vatican's archives that are closed off to the public? So why is it okay for one to have that, but not the other? And we have to really think about it in those kind of stark terms.
That's really, that's very helpful to have you put it in that clear, stark term. It also makes me, think about some of what I know of, limited way about NAGPRA, and how, it's this kind of legal construct that is so obviously limited in, defining its terms, in defining, and even sort of describing what's covered by these laws. And that I'm sure is incredibly frustrating, infuriating to people, so that a museum is allowed to say, well, no, that's not a recognized tribe, and therefore it's not covered by NAGPRA. That kind of, those issues, I'm sure, come up all the time.
Well, it does. And a couple case examples. I mean, there's literally hundreds of thousands of human remains in museum collections that are somebody's ancestor. I can't get past that. And part of the lunacy of NAGPRA in some ways was, well, you have to be able to name that individual from 1,000 years ago. Who's going to have that memory? So that's problem out number one. But then, of course, the famous case came along in the late 90s with the Kennewick map, and how that, you had an archaeologist that said, well, this is the first Caucasoid set of human remains we found that date 7,000 earlier years on the West Coast. So it seems impossible in that way. But Vine Delorier wrote a quick essay, said, hey, I went to study the art pieces and paintings of the tribes that lived in this area. Guess what? If you don't make him look like Jean-Luc Picard, he looks exactly like them. And of course, recently in the last year or two, they've come out with a new facial remodel of what he actually looked like. But I remember reading that archaeologist's first book, and he had so romanticized it that this stone piece was in his hip and he waded out into the water for the cooling effect on his aching bone. And he succumbed to the cold water and passed away, only to be discovered years later. And I will say that I remember praising the Army Corps of Engineers because they came in and dropped literally tons of dirt on the site so nobody would go, picking for other stuff. And we still see that today, that, people are so enamored with this kind of mythologized, indigenous constructed culture that people still go out when farmers till their fields looking for arrowheads and other debris left, and of course, that's where the NAGPRA ties in, because, it's still hard for me to fathom that, there's so many sets of human remains that are in collections that, and there's a big, strong spiritual belief that to disinter them disrupts their journey in the spirit life. And so we have to really think about it in those stark terms. Again, if we did it, in a Christian cemetery or a Catholic cemetery or, in all those ways, and we disrespected how the bodies were handled, there would be outcry, but yet, is it because Indigenous people are not that big of a part of the population any longer, or is it something else? And we have to look at, honestly, at those kind of concepts, that this is part of the net result of not seeing Indigenous people as fully functioning human society and civilizations that were complex and layered. I use it with my students. I use the analogy of breathing. Cultures expand and contract all the time. They absorb people in, they reject people, they change. And so we also have this quest in the mid 20th century and later where we began to really press people for this authentically accurate Indigenous person that doesn't really exist because it's a constructed thing in and of itself. And if you're, look at social media, there's all sorts of things and tugs and plays, there's, and we have to really think about that. But I want you to think about film in one way too. Dances with Wolves was the first time actual Indigenous language was spoken. And that was produced in the 1990s. And we're still far away from it. We have Reservation Dogs and Rutherford Falls and a couple other shows that are really kind of tapping into this now. And they're finding out Indigenous life is kind of funny. And, I think I loved Smoke Signals when I used to go to theater and watch it, because you could tell where the Indigenous people were in the audience or the Indian people were, because we'd laugh at the same stuff and the others wouldn't. And then they'd laugh at stuff we knew was kind of inappropriate. So, we have a lot to still learn, and there, of course, there's brilliant scholars doing this kind of work, from literature to film studies to poetry to all of it. And, history, anthropology, we're all thinking about that. But there's also an accountability that has to happen in order to reconcile and try to forge a path forward together. It's not all doom and gloom, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Well, I think that's probably a perfect place for us to stop. I can't thank you enough, Kevin, for all of this information, for your ideas, and for your helping us to sort of open up our thinking. And we really appreciate it. And I hope that this will be a useful moment for many museums to really start to do some of that serious rethinking. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.